No matter what you say, today could be the day. We've got plenty to learn and lots to see along the way. You know what time it is, no matter where you've been. So let's do it again. Listen up and let the sun shine in. We've got soul training. Time to practice what you preach. Ooh, yeah. Yes, we do. We've got soul training.
Hey, Joe, I know normally we start off with something really lighthearted. I think you once used the phrase piffy, and we kind of did like a word search.
I made up a word once, that one time.
We did the etymology. How do you say that?
I don't know. I didn't make that one up. That's all you.
The history of the words.
Etymology,
yes, that's it, of the word. And it was actually, I think, a real word. We normally use a piffy intro or a lighthearted intro like we're doing now, but I didn't want to spend a lot of time on that because I wanted to highlight some of the great work that our brother, friend, and confidant, Daniel Gaines, is doing. For our faithful and consistent listeners, you all know that me, Daniel, and Joe record same location, same room, everything. We're all together most of the time. But this time, it's not the case. Daniel is in Henderson, Tennessee, about 4 hours away, roughly. And but he's there not on vacation, but he's there to help bring others to Christ and to share his brilliance in the from the mission field. So I'd like for Daniel to kind of explain what he's up to in our future recordings for the next 8 or 9 months, roughly. Probably will be done like this, just the two of me and you together, and Daniel in another location. So Daniel, if you just kind of start from the top, and then we're going to start from the top in the Bible with Genesis. So you like how I kind of wove that together. We're starting from the top with Daniel.
Nice,
and we're going to start with the top.
You got the segue too quickly there. You got to put a pin in that and bring it back in just a minute.
He moves away. We recorded one episode, and suddenly he's telling us what to do.
I tell you, y'all, I've always heard in the education field, in order to be an expert to do a presentation, you got to be greater than 50 miles away. I've always heard that. So Daniel is greater than 50 miles away, so now he's an expert.
There you go. But this is not the farthest I've been away for recordings. I've been like 8,000 miles away before.
See, now he's flexing on us.
At least we're still in the same time zone this time.
Yeah, he just stepped over.
That is very helpful.
Flexing on us now.
But you gave us such a wonderful intro, and then we totally didn't let Daniel tell us what he's up to. So Daniel, if you don't mind, inform the people.
I'm having the opportunity this school year to serve as what's called missionary in residence at Freed-Hardeman University. So that's given me the opportunity to teach some classes here, and also primarily try to promote missions among the student body here. So I'll be trying to raise missions awareness, recruit missionaries, encourage people along those lines, be a part of, there's kind of a missionary, it's called missions group, but it's like a club for those that are interested in missions. So I'll be a part of that. But yeah, so getting to teach classes, both some kind of basic Bible classes like Life of Christ and Acts of the Apostles, as well as some more missions-oriented classes like personal evangelism and a class called Area Mission Studies. So I'm really excited about this opportunity. I've taught in schools of preaching quite a bit, but this is my first time in teaching American college students in an academic setting. And so far, I'm liking it a lot.
I think that's what he really went down there for, is to bring soul training into academia.
That's right.
I put soul training in my syllabi, and I've been promoting it among the students. So we may have some new listeners among the students.
Here's what you do. You got to have some like bonus questions on quizzes that are found deep in our catalog where we said something. They have to go search for it. Boy, that'll push our analytics over the edge.
You said academia.
Oh, that's really good. Look, we ought to have put a code word in right here. So if any of my students are listening to this podcast, we have to put in a code word for them to come and tell me. I don't know how to reward them.
Extra points.
Yeah.
Extra point.
Yeah, I did. You said academia. I thought that was a snack.
That was last episode where we discussed every candy known to man.
Oh, okay. Academia.
Yeah.
And that was
All right, so
macadamia.
if you're one of my students and you're listening to this, come up to me after class and say the word Arusha. Say the word Arusha. And I'll know that you were listening. I don't know if anything will happen, but I know you were listening.
You're getting good graces with the teacher anyhow.
That's right.
Before we leave this, I did have that one serious question. As you're teaching missions and you've been in the mission field, and it seems like I've asked you this once before, but I know the world has always been in trouble. The world's always been divided, and the world's always been at war. But with the things that are going on across the way, and I even saw a blurb or something the other day that Russia was trying to rally some troops or some support even in Latin America and those kind of things. But how does teaching a class on missions and with the backdrop of people being unsafe and kind of a dangerous place to travel outside the U.S., how does that change your approach as you're trying to recruit and explain the importance of mission work when you have people going, I don't know, I'm kind of concerned about my safety? How do you respond to that?
I don't think it really changes much at all because there's always been hot spots, dangerous zones in the world where you could choose to travel that would be dangerous. But even now, there's a whole lot of places I wouldn't hesitate at all to travel or take my family or a group of college kids or anything. So I think some of that is just through education, helping people understand that the world outside the U.S. is not inherently terrifying. It's a big world, and you can travel safely to a good bit of it.
Okay, you answered my question. He is an expert, Joe.
He is.
Yeah, he's
Cue Daniel's expert joke nobody gets right now. What is it? A spurt under pressure?
squirt.
Yeah, an expert's just somebody that used to be a drip under pressure.
Whatever.
Yeah, that's a bonus question right there.
One of these days, you're going to have to explain that to me because I totally don't get it. Do you get it?
Okay, so
I get it.
If you had like a drip of water,
yes,
and you put it under pressure, it's going to spurt. And so if
that's where I don't use that word spurt. I get you.
There you go.
One of my favorite basketball players was Spud Webb.
That's totally not related.
Oh, sorry.
Let's get to the topic.
The origin. He gave us the origin of what his work is, and we're going to look at the origin of the first book of the Bible called Genesis. And we know that Genesis not only focuses on the beginning and spread of sin in the world, but it also teaches us that God's promise will also come to fruition if we will turn to Him, and we see constant examples of that. And we're going to focus on the first 11 chapters. of Genesis. So
yeah, well, there's some in the first few chapters of Genesis. There are some big things happen there, namely, universe created from nothing. Man was created. Different things like that folks right now might have a hard time because they're so inundated by another point of view. They might think it's a myth or maybe not reliable. But hopefully today we're going to try to dispel those things and know that what Genesis says is it's literal. Some folks don't want to take it literally, but it really happened. It's history.
I even think about just the first few verses, and I'll let Daniel pass the ball to him, but the first few verses of chapter 1 of Genesis, to me, that's everything from the atmosphere to the seasons to the days of the week. I mean, you think about just not even look at our like my body temperature. Our body temperature has to be a certain amount. I mean, a degree, 98.6. But you think about if we don't have seasons, you think about if we don't have the sun and the moon and just everything, if it would just be off just a little bit, the havoc that it would create. Yeah. But everything is so perfectly aligned that just did not happen from a snap of a finger, a big bang, or coming from nothing, and all those things that are being taught in schools on the average. And, I like Daniel was always reminding us that our catalog can be evergreen, but today is we're about in the middle of August, and most schools in our location have already gone back to school or about to. So there'll be countless classrooms that will talk about the Big Bang Theory, the evolution, Darwin, Galapagos Island, all of those things. So, but if you read Scripture, we see that God created everything because of the history of creation. So, Daniel, I'm just throwing the ball to you down in Henderson, Tennessee.
Well, I think that a lot of people that are Christians or consider themselves to be Christians that believe in parts of the Bible, some of them are almost embarrassed of the first 11 chapters of Genesis because of the fantastic nature of some of that stuff. They want to think that it's, people that are secular, people that are not wanting to take the Bible literally, really want to view all that stuff as mythology. They want to view it as parables. They want to view it as just kind of general object lessons and things like that, and not as literal history. But there's some significant theological problems with doing that, because here at the beginning, and the book of Genesis literally means beginning. It's all about beginnings. It tells us the answers to so many things that form our basic worldview as we're thinking about how we got here, why we were created, how the world got here. It forms our kind of our self-identity. And it's because of Genesis, the first few chapters, that we know we were created in the image of God. That concept, that's a huge theological concept, that we were created in the image of God. That defines value in life. And think about so many doctrines have their roots, their origins in those first 11 chapters. Things like the institution of marriage, things like gender roles, things like our attitudes towards sexuality, the origin of sin, the origin of death, the why death is here, why suffering exists, the idea of redemption, a need for redemption, how that's going to come from, has its roots in those first few chapters of Genesis. Even the idea of modesty has its roots there.
And free will, the freedom of choice.
Absolutely, free will, and for those that are ecology minded, even the idea of being stewards of the earth, that comes from those first few chapters. Or even for the secularists, the reason we have a 7-day week comes from those first chapters of Genesis. So there's so much of our theology and even just our worldview in general that is rooted in those first chapters of Genesis, that if we were to rip away a literal interpretation of that and say, none of that stuff really happened, that's all just myths and figurative stuff and fairy tales and stories. If we were to do that, it really shakes the underpinnings of so much of standard Christian doctrine and things that we believe about the Bible, and that people in the Bible believed about themselves, and that the Bible portrays about itself.
And you mentioned something about marriage, and I think about in two places, Genesis 1:27 and Genesis 2:24. And later on in the New Testament, those are cross-referenced, are again in Matthew 19:4-5 and Mark 10:6-8. And so, the question was asked, one article that we read to kind of do a little preparation for this is, did Jesus mean to ground marriage on the fairy tales? And we know the answer is no. And everything that we know about marriage is started and was founded in Genesis in the beginning of time. And that carries on because every New Testament writer at some point will reach back and point to Genesis at some point or another. And even Jesus mentioned Abel as a real person whose blood was shed on his account for righteous behavior. So even Jesus is referencing Genesis. So I mean, there's too many connectors, for us to say that it's fairy tales or it's myth or that it's not true, because it's found in all 66 books of the Bible.
Yeah, sure. And the New Testament references back to these events in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, about 25 times directly, and some say maybe at least 60 times there are allusions to those things. And you mentioned a couple. Let's go through maybe a few more as Jesus makes reference back. And the purpose of going through this for our dear listener is notice these other Bible writers and inspired people that reference these events from the first 11 chapters as reasons for theological positions. They're referencing them as real historical events that you couldn't, if they were just allegories, you wouldn't base theology on them. You wouldn't base life on them. But like you mentioned, Jesus specifically references Genesis 1:27 and Genesis 2:24 as these foundations for and historical precedents for marriage. He does that in Matthew 19, verses 4 and 5, and again in Mark chapter 10, verses 6 and through 8. You can see those there. Also, one thing that's striking to me is what Jesus says in John chapter 5, verse 46, talking about the writings of Moses, which of course Genesis is part of the writings of Moses. Jesus says in John 5, verse 47, if you do not believe his writings, Moses' writings, how will you believe my words? So there Jesus is even putting some of his own credibility on the line with the credibility of the writings of Moses. That includes this.
Yeah, that totally knocks out that theory of, well, I believe Jesus and believe he's the Son of God, but you can't literally believe the flood happened. Well, Jesus literally believed the flood happened, and he says so right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of, it goes back to your worldview and the filters that you have for yourself. For me, I'm going to filter everything that I take in outside the Bible through the Bible first. If I'm sensing any tension, if I'm sensing any conflict, I'm going to trust what the Bible says over what anything else says. But you have a lot of people that are going to come to the Bible with just the opposite type of filter. They're going to filter the Bible through what conventional wisdom of the day says or popular science of the day says. And you have to say of the day because science has changed. Science hasn't changed, but scientists have changed what they believe and teach about so many things so many times. Yet you have people that the Bible, even though it never changes and it continually winds up being vindicated through time, are going to trust the shifting sands of current thought and popular opinion over.
Yeah, that's interesting you bring that up because just this morning I heard about a U.S. government official talking about the science is evolving. And that I had that exact same thought as that, the science is evolving. That means what they thought they knew, they don't know, is what that means to me. Meanwhile, our God and our Word of God is not evolving. There's no need. We have it perfectly right here. Well, science is always chasing rabbits. They can't nail some things down. They've done a good job with some things, but
because they think those rabbits are evolving into deer.
Evolving rabbits. Maybe. I don't know.
Sometimes.
I don't think that's what they were referring to, but sure.
And sometimes, and this is, I'm not trying to be funny or silly, I guess, but it seems silly to me that you think about evolution, the evolutionists who discredit creation and that things that we just started making changes throughout history and time. But to me, I've always thought, if that's true, which it's not, but if it's true, then how come we're not still evolving? I've always...
That's what I think, because if in the chain of events that we were taught, we supposedly through the eyes of science came through what animal?
I always thought it was the missing link.
Well,
Gorilla?
but they say monkeys or
Monkey.
apes, right? Well, why do we still have apes and monkeys if that's how it goes?
When I used to take my kids to the zoo when they were smaller, my biggest fear was hearing a knock and a little, like a gorilla or something going, "Hey, I'm done. Get me out.
I'm out.
Can you get me out? Get me on the zoo."
Well,
That never happened.
In the interest of presenting the other side fairly, I'm definitely not an evolutionist, but I think what they would say to the objection you brought up is they don't say that we came from monkeys. They say that we and monkeys descended from a common ancestor.
It's still, that doesn't hold water with me. Well, why did they stop?
No, it doesn't.
Being,
It doesn't mean either.
why did they
Yeah.
stop at being monkeys? Why didn't they keep evolving onto something else too?
Yeah, right.
Sorry to get us off on that.
You're making me
Where were we?
go bananas there for a second.
Yeah.
Zing,
Zing.
See?
Yeah, we're talking about whether this stuff in early Genesis is mythology or not. Now, another point of evidence that the rest of the Bible doesn't consider it to be mythology is you look at the genealogies of Jesus, for example, and we're pinning everything on Jesus. If you're a Christian, he is our absolute hope. We look at the genealogies about Jesus that kind of define where he came from, and it's going to include people like Adam and Seth and Enoch and Noah from these first few chapters of Genesis, treating them as real, literal people that existed, that are in Jesus's genealogy. You can't treat that stuff as figurative and still believe the way the rest of the Bible deals with it.
Go ahead, Joe.
No,
I thought you were going to say, okay. I was just wanting to talk about quickly about, we talked about we would stick to the first 11 chapters, and I think about language. You think about the Tower of Babel. Some notes that we talked about. We talked about figurative language versus literal language. And there's one section in an article we read about linguistic proof that Genesis is literal history. And you think about even how, the different languages and how we do have different languages and we have different dialects and we have different ways of communicating. For me, further proves, chapter 11 of Genesis chapter 1, that the Bible is literal, and the Bible also teaches us that what it says has happened from even down to our language, the way we communicate.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Because chapter 11, verse 1 of Genesis says, "Now the whole earth had one language and one speech, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there." And then we go the rest of what happens. We see that God intervenes with a game changer of language.
In verse 7, it confused the language. And something else and our time is quickly approaching. Then we got about 6-7 minutes left. But the flood.
Yeah, I forgot to start the timer at the beginning. So
the flood. People have a hard time with the ark and with the flood. I encourage you. I don't know if you guys have seen. Y'all seen this movie? Is Genesis History, came out maybe 6-7 years ago. Have you seen that,
Kind
Daniel?
of a documentary.
Yeah, it's a documentary, and what they do is go around and interview creationist scientists, and they get to tell their side of it. And now maybe we don't agree with everything in there, but they make a pretty compelling case that there is evidence for the flood. So I would encourage people that are listening to watch that movie. Is Genesis History, used to be on like all the streaming stuff.
Yeah, we
I
showed
think
one.
that's a production of Answers in Genesis, which is the same company that did the Ark encounter up in northern Kentucky and the Creation Museum. I think they're sort of.
And I would
affiliated.
also encourage people, Daniel, have you been to the Ark up there to see it?
Oh yeah.
Have you seen it, Alan?
I've been to the Creation Museum, but here's the funny things. I listen to you talk. Our South Greenians who are listening to this, I think my kids would remember in northern Kentucky, we started a stateside mission effort. We went up there for about 5 years in northern Kentucky, and the local preacher there, one day we were out working, he drove us up to this big hill that overlooked where they were scratching out the ground.
So you saw where it was going to be.
I saw where it was going to be, yeah. And looking back, I wished I would have. I'm sure I maybe took pictures. I don't know if my phone had capability. This is 2000. This has been several years ago.
Your rotary phone you took up there?
A few years ago. No, I had a smartphone, I think. But it was pretty neat to look back at that, where it was going to be. And
well, I bring the Ark up because if anybody thinks, well, there's no way there was a boat big enough to hold the animals, you take a good look at that Ark. It's a big boat, and not only that, we've talked before. There's been I don't have it in front of me. I want to say it was Oxford. Some students at Oxford did a study. Is that right? Anyhow, they took the dimensions that's laid out in the Bible, built a boat down to scale, and discovered that with those dimensions, it floats. It works.
Yeah, not only does it work, but that's ideal dimensions for seaworthiness. If you're not worried about speed, you're just worried about staying afloat. That's the perfect dimensions.
Yeah.
And talking about the Ark encounter, I thought they did a really good job of showing how the Ark was feasible. You know, there's some speculation as to how they did different things, but they look at some different objections, like the Ark you couldn't have done it because of this or because of that, and they demonstrate possible logistical solutions, ways they could have handled those objections. Not saying that is exactly what they did, but just showing plausibility. I think maybe is a good way to put what they've done. So anyway, as we're trying to wrap up here, mention a few more of these things. Paul seems to view the early part of Genesis as history. He's quoting Genesis 1:3 to talk about how God causes light to shine out of darkness. He quotes Genesis 2:7, referring to Adam as the first human, looking at him as a literal person. He claims Adam was made from dust in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 47, talks about woman being taken out of man's body. And you can go to Peter too. Peter regards the flood as an actual historical event with 8 survivors. He talks about that in 1 Peter chapter 3 and 2 Peter chapter 2. He believes in the historical person of Lot there in Genesis chapter 11, and that God actually turned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes. And Jesus also refers to Sodom and Gomorrah as literal places, and takes what has happened to them as being historical precedent. You got the writer of Hebrews that is all about Genesis and the stuff that he does, talking about Christ being a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, and just all types of stuff. Just go to Hebrews chapter 11 alone. We talk about that as kind of being the faith hall of fame, this who's who of personalities, and it's loaded down with examples of people from Genesis: Cain and Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. These people are treated by the rest of the Bible as historical individuals. Their stories are treated as historical. And we do a disservice not only to early Genesis, we do a disservice to the whole rest of the Bible and the underpinnings of Christian theology if we try to take away those first few chapters, because they're sort of the preface, the preamble. Maybe they form the worldview by which the entire Bible is built. Does that make sense?
It does, because I just want to springboard off one point to help, I guess, reinforce that. I read a quote, or I'm reading a quote that says, "The integrity of the entire Bible is seriously undermined when anyone compromises the literal, historical nature of the book of Genesis. With its critical teaching on origins, obstinately clinging to evolution, theistic or otherwise, and stubbornly insisting on a relaxed, devalued interpretation of Genesis can only end in a diluted religion. And
who's that quote from?
that is from the Apologetics article, and looks like the author is Dr. Dave Miller.
So Apologetics Press, Dave Miller.
Yep, that's give him credit for that. And I like what he is saying, that that if we discount or dilute or distance ourselves from Scripture, but the Old Testament for sure, you end up with a diluted, watered down, no pun intended, because we were talking about the ark, but a diluted, watered down religion, and that's true. You end up something that's really not even surface level, but it's faulty all the way around. So we could talk for...
Yeah. If you're going to believe the Bible, you got to believe all the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
You do. You don't get to pick and choose. Once you start doing that, it's pulling threads, and eventually you pull enough to where your faith unravels. Now you deal with literature appropriately. There are different types of literature in the Bible. You're going to interpret apocalyptic literature differently than you are historical literature, and that's not doing violence to the Scriptures. But we need to believe it all. We need to believe it all.
And Genesis is obviously, that's history.
That's history. It's written like history. It's history all the way through. So thank you, Big Show Joe, for making the magic happen. You had to jump through some extra hoops to make this happen with our distance recording that we're doing right now. And thank you, Melatones Jones, for bringing that special quality that you always do. You make the show special. And I want to thank the elders at South Green Street Church of Christ for making soul training possible. And I want to thank you, dear listener, most of all, for letting us be a part of your day and your spiritual journey. And until next time, keep soul training.
Soul training. Time to practice what you preach. Ooh, yeah. Yes, we do. We've got soul training.
To learn more, you can email us at soultrainingpodcast@gmail.com, or you can write to us, P.O. Box 503, Glasgow, Kentucky, 42142. That's Soul Training.